Okay, so I recently purchased a Carbon Express Piledriver, and I was rather disappointed with the trigger on it. It had a very long trigger without a very crisp end without a crisp wall as well. So I'm going to be demonstrating how to do a trigger job on the Carbon Express Piledriver. This is going to should apply to any crossbow that has any AR style trigger mechanism, but go ahead and feel free to try to apply it as is. So I've gone ahead and I've already stripped down most of the aspects off of the Carbon Express Piledriver, because you have to pretty much pull everything apart to get to the trigger. So the trigger mechanism is located inside here, and in order to get to that, you have to remove the several bolts that are holding on the crossbow rail here. So 1, 2, 3. Then there's a fourth one here, which is why I've removed the handle already. So you have to remove the handle to get to that fourth one there. And then also you have to make sure that you remove this bolt as well. That's going to allow you to take the whole system off. And then we'll get into the trigger. So I'll see you there. So it's a series of 4mm Allen bolts. They are removed like this. For some reason that I don't understand, this bolt here, rather than being metric, is actually a 1/8 bolt. So you got to go ahead and remove that one as well. Now all these bolts are Loctited. They should come out pretty easy, but they got leftover Loctite on them. And each one is, or all 4 of these bolts that hold on the rail are the same size, so you don't have to worry about keeping track of which one's which. And there they are, all 4 of them plus the front one. And then after you do that, the whole rail simply slides away. So we're not really interested in that for now. Just make sure that you don't lose your cable slide. If you do happen to lose your cable slide, here's a good shot of it, so that if it pops off, you know how to get it back in the same place. Okay, so here we can see start to see the makings of the trigger mechanism. And we're going to get a little bit deeper into that here. So we have to remove the rail off of the whole trigger mechanism in order to get to split this piece apart. And we've also got to remove these 2 bolts on the bottom. These 2 bolts on the bottom are 9/64. Oop, wrong one. They're 9/64, and they can be removed just like so. If I find my 9/64 bit, that is. Sorry about the camera work. It's kind of hard to hold the camera and remove the hardware at the same time. With both the bolts removed, our trigger mechanism comes out. So here we can see the attachment mechanism. If you're really interested, there's some trigger slops side to side. They can be fixed by putting some bushings into there. you're probably going to have to push that pin out and remove one or both of these Carbon Express covers, or you could possibly clip something over top of them. At the moment, I'm just going to go ahead and leave them where they are. So we have to remove that screw right there, and that's going to allow us to free our trigger mechanism. So, word of caution as you're reinstalling that trigger or that screw there, make sure that you don't tighten it all the way, because you do want it to be free to pivot a little bit so that as you squeeze the trigger, this can go backwards. So next we have to remove the Picatinny rail off the top, and the rest of our screws can be removed using a 3/32 Allen wrench. I'm just going to go ahead and put the camera down while I do this. Okay, with the Picatinny rail removed, we've removed those two screws there. They look just like that. And we can see our third and fourth screw. So fourth screw up on top. 1, 2, 3. Now this fourth screw on top, you actually don't need to remove that. That holds in a piece that we don't need to bother with. But we have to remove these three, and you had to remove the Picatinny to get to that one there. And so we're going to go ahead and remove those. Now be careful as you're removing the plate. We're going to remove them from this side, but then we're going to flip the mechanism over on this side before we pull it out, and I'll show you why in just a moment. Okay, I have all three screws out. Now do notice that there are two screws that are slightly longer than the third screw. So that third screw, if you get mixed up, goes up here on the Picatinny rail part. The other two are of equal size. So you want to be really careful to keep this together and then flip it over. Now here's why. So we can remove this plate. There's a little bearing, and it might even have just popped off. Nope, there it is. There's a little bearing right there. It holds the safety reset here. This is the safety reset. And it sits right there in the top plate, just like that. So when you cock the trigger, or excuse me, cock the string back, it pushes your safety back from fire to safe. So that little bearing there is what it rides on. There's a spring behind it, and if you're holding it the other way, you're going to drop that bearing and probably lose it. Also, this is your dry fire prevention, and that might possibly pop out. It's simply held on with a little pin, and then you have the spring in the middle. So that pin easily comes out, but everything goes back really easy as well. So put that back in place. Put that back on top. We are going to need to make sure that we adjust this slightly because of this right here, this pin. We need to push that down when we put everything back together, but I'll come back to that later. Okay, so for now, what we're interested in here, I've already done a little bit of work on this, but this trigger still needs a little bit more work. So this is essentially, if you're looking at a pistol, this would be your hammer, and here's your trigger. So right here, this face here, this is what we're trying to remove. So it's very tall stock. I've already cut it down some, but I want to cut it down further. What causes a long trigger pull is, see if I can reset it here. Alright, is how long it takes for this right here, which is called the sear, that vertical face, how long it takes for that to be pulled down to release your hammer, or your string release actually. So, see if I can capture this on video. As this starts coming down, you see that's your trigger creep. The further down that goes, that's the longer your trigger is before finally the trigger breaks free. So we're trying to keep a nice sharp edge here, and actually we can sharpen this edge up here too, but we want to keep a nice sharp edge there so that we get a good clean trigger break, but we want to bring this down so that there's a whole lot less trigger creep. So this spring right here, there's a plunger right here with a spring. This is our trigger spring. We're going to want to make sure that we keep track of this because that has a tendency to pop out as well, and I'll show you how to do that. There's also a small spring up here, the spring on the hammer. That's what allows it to pop up so easily, that plus the string pressure. So this, pretty much, there's not a whole lot to worry about here. This comes up, just don't lose your spring. The spring is very easy to put back in place. There's a little recess up top that holds the spring, and then you can just tuck it into there. So this face here, from the factory, there's a little bit of a rounded edge. I've already taken this off, and I've filed it. So I filed it backwards that way, just a little bit, to keep a nice flat face there, but to get rid of the small curvature that's there on the stock trigger. That is going to allow me to get a slightly crisper trigger, instead of having a rolling trigger where it starts to release but it's got a gradual release. I want a nice, clean, solid break. A lot of rifle shooters describe it as breaking glass. So that's what I'm looking for. So I took that off and I filed that down. Alright, now this here. So what we want to do is we're going to push this up here. So there's a hole in the middle here, and this sits in there with this, and it's got a stop for the spring. And then as you push back, this is actually how your safety mechanism works. As you pull back on the spring or trigger, it pushes that up. When the safety's on, the safety is back there, and it prevents that from going up, which keeps you from being able to pull the trigger, and it keeps the sear from being able to release. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick a flathead screwdriver in here. I'm just going to have to probably just describe this because it's going to be really hard to video holding the camera with one hand. You push up with the flathead screwdriver, and then you can just simply pull this out. You can just pull it out, but that's going to come shooting out, so just be aware and go ahead and catch that. There's a lot of learning going on for me here. I've switched over to using a tripod so that I can use both hands and really kind of demonstrate what I'm doing instead of doing a whole lot of cutscenes. I have a few other things that have happened in the meantime, and I'll touch on them as I get to them. So, first thing, I'm going to go ahead and remove, this is the dry fire prevention unit here. It's got this little spring here. I want to make sure that I don't lose that, so I'm going to go ahead and remove that, set it aside in my parts pile. Now I'm going to show you how you remove the actual trigger linkage piece here. So you see this sliding piston here, there's a spring in there. That's what gives you trigger return spring pressure. So I'm going to show you how I remove this. I'm sure there's a dozen ways to do it to make sure that you don't lose this piece, but this is a way. This is how I like to do it. So you want to slide it up first, just a little bit, so that I have enough room to, I'm just using an Allen wrench here, but anything skinny enough and flat to put pressure on that spring to allow you to slide this up. And it popped out on me anyway. Take this unit out so that you don't lose it. It will shoot itself across a room. If you lose it, you're going to be lacking return spring pressure. So set that aside. That goes right inside. It's hard to see, but that goes right inside this hole here. There it is. Goes inside that hole, and that's where that spring gets retained. So this is the piece that we're really looking for. I've already done, actually I've done at this point in time all of my work on this piece, but when I started shooting this video, I had not done all my work on this piece. So this face here, I have significantly ground down, and actually at this point I milled it down because grinding was not working so well for me. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to reduce the height of this lip here. That works together with the trigger, and you're decreasing the amount of metal engaging here, because the more metal you have engaging, the more trigger creep you're going to have before it finally breaks free. Okay, so those of you with a sharp eye are going to notice that this piece looks a little bit different than it used to. So The other part that really can make a big difference on your trigger is how clean and how crisp the edge is right here. So the piece that comes stock, just like this one, is, or at least appears to be, a cast piece. I have a piece milled from stainless steel here, not because I wanted to go crazy and be cool, although that was kind of fun. It was quite a long project, but because I was trying to clean this up and I got a little bit impatient. So here's your impatience warning. I put this in a fixture and then took power tools to it, trying to, because I got tired of trying to clean this up by hand, and I didn't have it in a good tight vise, and I threw the part across the room and ended up breaking one of these off. So that diverted me into a many-week side trip where I had to redesign this from scratch, or actually from measurements on the broken piece, model it on the computer in CAD, and then mill it out by hand. So that was a long process, but I do now have an upgraded stainless steel solid piece, and if anyone is interested, I can at least consider providing the CAD data so that someone else can do the same. So you please take your time, use good fixturing, either use a nice trigger file that is going to give you it's going to allow you to file things at a very level, even plane, or put it on a mill if you have access to a mill so that you can hold it in a vise and cut it nice and clean on the face, as I have now done right here. You can see I've missed a little bit there just from older filing. And if I decide after I shoot this for a while that I really want the trigger a little bit lighter, I can go back and I can clean that up a little bit more, but I think I like the trigger where it is right now. So that's the big thing there. We are taking this down because that's going to reduce the amount of trigger pull necessary to fire the crossbow. You want to make sure that you have a good clean edge right here, right there on that corner, because that clean edge is going to give you a crisp trigger break. And likewise, you need a very clean edge right on that corner here. Don't be afraid to undercut, going in at an angle kind of like that, as long as it leaves you a very sharp, crisp line here, and you really want that to be perpendicular to the plane of the whole mechanism there. You don't want it to be at an odd angle, or you're going to get some continuous creep as the trigger gradually disengages instead of a crisp break. So that's the pieces. That's how you take everything apart. Sorry I don't have any of the videos of cleaning all the trigger pieces up. If I end up going through to further grind that down, I might go ahead and make some video of that, but for now I'll just show you what the reassembly looks like. So again, we're back here. So we start with the trigger pressure spring. Don't get frustrated with this. It takes a little bit. So it goes in here, but you have to have it positioned kind of just right so that it'll start feeding itself in. But it's just about being centered on that spring. So you take the lower trigger piece here and you start it on the pin. Now this is designed to keep it from going past here, so this is where we need to basically reverse my removal process. So you're going to try to wiggle it into the hole. There we go. And then you're going to push down on your trigger mechanism to reseat. Now you have that trigger pressure, that trigger back pressure there. Again, make sure that you keep that ball bearing, either keep track of that ball bearing or make sure that you keep it in place. Okay, now you can put this in place now if you like, but so we reseat this. This pin slides through. Don't drop the pin. and it sits down like that. So the pin goes in place. Kind of hard to keep making sure that you have a good shot while you're looking at the part. Pin goes in place. You want to make sure that the spring stays in this unit here as well as right there in that detent. Now we're going to have to do a little bit more with that when we put the cover back on, but I'll get to that. The last piece we have here, and you have to pull the trigger to get it in, is the back pressure spring for up here. If you don't release the trigger, it's really hard to get into that tiny little space. So you're going to go ahead and cock the crossbow just like that, or the mechanism right like that. And here you can finally see what all that work that we've done obtains for you. So here with very minimal trigger creep, I get a very crisp break with minimal trigger creep, and then when I actually have everything hooked up, it feels very good, very natural, I guess. So, putting the cover back on. You got two options. You can either put a little bit of grease in here on the back side to kind of keep it stuck, or you can just kind of go with the sandwich method. So, again, remembering this ball bearing right there. Got to keep track of that ball bearing. You position the slide forward to match the safety being forward. And you're just going to bring all the pieces together. Like that. Now it's not going to go together up front here. See if I can get a good shot of that. It's not going to go together because this, the dry fire prevention mechanism, has to be pushed down into a slot on this face here. So once you get it pushed down, it'll close right up. Then you can take your screws, your two long ones and your middle length one. The shorter one goes here. Again, this is a 3/16 Allen wrench. And your two longer pieces go in here. If you're looking for further adjustability, this screw right here underneath the safety lever on the right side of the mechanism, that can be screwed in or pulled out just a little bit. That ties into the ball bearing that I kept telling you not to lose, and that provides extra retaining pressure or less retaining pressure for the safety mechanism. Alright, so now I have the crossbow on fire. Boom, trigger goes off. Something doesn't seem right here because that should be springing up. Oh, there it goes. So you can reset it with anything. Sorry, let me do that again. You have to act like you're an arrow, pushing that down. Put it on fire. Boom. Crossbow goes off. Reset. See if I can do this. Here we go. Reset. Now it goes back. The dry fire prevention mechanism is up. And I can't put it on fire until I depress that and slide my safety forward. But now, that dry fire prevention mechanism isn't going to come back until you shoot it again. So just beware. Assembly time. So we take our unit here. And we're going to go ahead and take a 5/64 Allen wrench. And these two screws here. And we're going to reattach the Picatinny rail with our arrow finger here, or whatever the heck that's called. If you do have a problem with your pressure, now's the time to adjust it. If you don't have enough, go ahead and bend that down. If you have too much, you can flatten it out. If you really need to, you can go ahead and unattach that to get better angles on it. But I've already adjusted mine. I like it where it is. So you just line it up. It's got a nice little groove here. Take the two screws and reinstall. want that nice and tight as you can get it, because that's going to securely mount your scope. So the tighter that is, the less chance there is that your scope can move. Alright, nice and tight. Okay, next step. We got to reattach the trigger to the stock. So that uses the same wrench there. So taking our 5/64, bring the stock back out. So we've got the arm that we just detached the trigger from. You want to bring it out a little bit so that we can just reattach just like that. It does go on the outside there. Now you want to be just kind of careful with how tight you make it or not, because it can make that trigger a bit stiff. It's best to take it tight and then just give it one little crack loose. It has Loctite, so it shouldn't come loose. Alright, so that just seats back down inside the stock. Now we got to reattach the two bolts here. It's these two bolts right here. Get them in focus. There we go. They take a 1/8, excuse me, they take a 9/64 Allen wrench. They just go right inside the stock through the two holes. Just hold the trigger mechanism down in place. Once again, we're going to want to tighten these as tight as possible, because once again, that holds our scope assembly indirectly attached to the stock. So the tighter the better, because we don't want, again, movement between those. If you really want to, I don't see why you couldn't put some washers in there so you can really torque this down. I might come back and do that on a later date. Okay, now's the time to turn our crossbow back into a crossbow. So we have 4 bolts, all identical, all with Loctite on them, like this. Using a 5/32 Allen wrench. And they reattach here, 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 and here. Those made up with the 4 holes inside our rail slide / crossbow assembly, because I didn't want to bother taking this off. There's no need to. You have to slide the tip in first. Excuse me, slide the back end first and get everything all lined up. Just like that. And reinstall the 4 screws. Helps if you grab the right wrench off your table. Trying to do this in real time so that you guys can see exactly what this job takes and entails. Alright. Tighten that down. I'm sure there are actual torque values that is supposed to be used here. I don't know what they are. If anyone has a link to that, feel free to post that. Again, just like everything, you want to go as tight as you can without damaging things, because everything tying together to everything is what gives you the accuracy that you want. Okay, one final bolt on here. That is your with a 1/8 wrench. This little guy, see if I can get that in focus. Doesn't really want to focus up, but this little guy right here, there we go. Got a little bit of blue Loctite on the end here. Should have a washer. Goes on the front end of the crossbow using your 1/8 wrench. That locks everything into place. So again, we didn't have to remove the bow assembly from the front of the crossbow or the rail to do this whole thing, but we did have to remove the grip, which is our last thing to do there. All right, nice and tight on that. Okay, so I kept inside this here, I kept the screw for my grip. Forget which wrench this is. This is a 1/8 wrench. So you do want one that's a little bit deep because you got to go all the way through here. Probably the easiest way to do it is to put it on the end of the wrench. Raise it all the way through. That way I have it really hard to see. There you go, sticking out the end. Now we can reattach. Here I am, screwing the handle back in. Nice and tight. All right. Once again, we have a fully assembled Carbon Express pile driver, now with a trigger job on it. Go ahead and remount all your accessories. We can try it out. Brief wrap up here. So after reviewing, editing, and splicing all my shots together, I noticed a couple things. So first I want to point out the trigger filing. So there's a mechanism called, or there's a device called a trigger file. It's very similar if anyone's used a specialty knife file to get the right angle on the knife. It's the same concept. It files your trigger sear really nice. There's a bar on the end of a hand file, and it kind of keeps everything at exactly the angle that you set it at. That's probably the ideal way to do this if you don't have access to a mill or something like that. The other way to do it is really carefully with a hand file and a bench vise. That's what I started with. Then I got impatient with the power tools and threw the parts. Again, there's that warning. If anyone really wants it, I will provide that CAD file so that you can make your own replacement trigger release component, but it is a rather complex part. And if you're not running CNC, if you are running CNC, it's going to be a bunch of ops unless you have 5-axis. If you're not running CNC, it's a real pain. It probably took me about 7 or 8 hours of milling on a manual Bridgeport. Here's my pile driver setup. So I've kept it mostly stock. I put a nice scope level on here to make sure that I have the scope exactly where I want it. I put a swivel bipod on here, expandable bipod, and I modified or used a different quiver than the stock quiver to put it on the side so that it runs along and it's a much more compact unit. And then when I bought it used. It came with a nice little sling here. I think a sling is stock, but obviously that is not a stock sling. So I will post a wrap-up video eventually, hopefully within the next week or so, of shooting it and show the differences in the trigger. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe and like. Hope to be doing some turkey hunting with this later this year. Hopefully we can get that on camera.